The autumn wind swept across the Kansas plains in 1847, carrying with it the scent of burning grass and something that made 17-year-old Sarah McKenna's blood run cold. From her hiding spot behind the overturned wagon, she watched as painted warriors circled her family's homestead like wolves around wounded prey. Her younger sister Emma, barely 14, lay unconscious beside their dying father, a Comanche arrow protruding from his chest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah knew the stories. She'd heard what happened to captured frontier girls. But as the war cries grew closer and Emma stirred weakly, Sarah McKenna made a decision that would change the course of two cultures forever. She would offer herself and trade one sister's freedom for another's fate. What she couldn't have known was that among those circling warriors rode a man who would see in her not a captive, but a queen. The McKenna family had arrived in Kansas territory just 3 months earlier, part of the great westward migration that promised land, opportunity, and a fresh start. Thomas McKenna, a widower since his wife died of consumption 2 winters back, had loaded his 2 daughters and their meager possessions into a covered wagon and joined a train of 40 families heading west from Missouri. Sarah had been against the move from the beginning. At 17, she was old enough to understand what they were leaving behind. The small community in Independence where everyone knew their name. The grave where her mother lay buried beneath a stone cross. The predictable rhythms of civilized life. But Thomas McKenna was a dreamer, filled with talk of fertile soil and endless horizons, and 14-year-old Emma had inherited his optimism. "Just think, Sarah," Emma had said as their wagon rolled across the endless prairie, "we'll have our own land. Maybe I'll even learn to ride horses like the frontier women do." Sarah had smiled at her sister's enthusiasm, but privately worried about Emma's delicate constitution. The girl had always been frail, prone to fevers and weak spells that left their father pacing the floor with worry. The harsh frontier seemed no place for someone so fragile. Their homestead sat in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills covered in tall grass that waved like ocean swells in the constant wind. Thomas had chosen the location for its proximity to a clear-running creek and the natural shelter provided by a grove of cottonwood trees. Within weeks of their arrival, he had built a modest cabin of logs and sod, with Sarah and Emma sleeping in the loft while he took the main room. The isolation had been the hardest part for Sarah. Their nearest neighbors, the Hartwell family, lived 8 miles east, and the small settlement of Cedar Falls lay a full day's ride to the south. During the long summer days, as Thomas worked to clear fields and plant late crops, Sarah found herself studying the horizon with growing unease. "Indians don't usually come this far east," Thomas had assured her when she voiced her concerns. "The army's got them pushed back into the western territories now." But Sarah had noticed things her father missed or chose to ignore. Tracks in the soft earth near the creek that didn't belong to deer or cattle. The way their few livestock grew nervous at certain times, bunching together and staring toward the hills with wide, frightened eyes. Most unsettling of all, the feeling of being watched that seemed to follow her whenever she ventured beyond the immediate vicinity of their cabin. The attack came on a crisp October morning when Thomas had ridden to the Hartwell place to help with their harvest. Sarah had been hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between 2 cottonwoods when Emma's scream shattered the morning quiet. "Sarah, they're coming!" From the hills to the north, a war party of 12 Comanche warriors descended like a storm made flesh. Their horses moved with deadly grace across the prairie, and even from a distance, Sarah could see the paint on their faces and the weapons in their hands. Training kicked in. The endless drills Thomas had made them practice for exactly this situation. Sarah grabbed Emma's hand and ran for the cabin, but they were only halfway there when an arrow whispered past Sarah's ear, close enough that she felt the fletching brush her cheek. "The wagon!" Sarah shouted, changing direction toward their overturned prairie schooner that Thomas had been using for storage. They dove behind it just as the war party reached the yard, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard packed earth. The attack was swift and brutal. The warriors set fire to the cabin with burning arrows, then systematically destroyed everything the McKenna family had worked to build. Sarah held Emma close as her sister sobbed, both of them knowing that their father would return to find his dreams reduced to ash and ember. But the Comanche weren't finished. As the smoke from the burning cabin rose into the clear morning sky, Sarah heard voices, not the wild war cries she expected, but calm, measured conversation in a language she didn't understand. Through a gap in the wagon's canvas cover, she watched the warriors dismount and begin searching the area with methodical precision. They were looking for survivors. Emma had fallen unconscious from fear, her breathing shallow and rapid in a way that reminded Sarah of her sister's childhood fevers. Sarah knew they couldn't run. Emma was too weak, and the open prairie offered no shelter. Their only hope was to remain hidden until the war party moved on. That hope died when one of the warriors, a young man with intricate tattoos covering his chest and arms, found their tracks leading to the wagon. He called out to his companions, and within moments, Sarah found herself staring up at a circle of painted faces and glittering weapons. The leader was immediately recognizable, not just by the eagle feathers in his hair or the ornate breastplate he wore, but by the authority in his bearing. He was perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command, and the other warriors stepped back to give him room. Sarah had learned enough Comanche words from traders who passed through Independence to understand fragments of their conversation. They were debating what to do with the two white girls they'd found. Some wanted to kill them outright. Others suggested taking them back to their camp as slaves, but the leader, Sarah would later learn his name was Standing Bear, seemed to have different ideas. His gaze lingered on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl, but there was something else in his expression, something that looked almost like respect. Standing Bear knelt beside the wagon and spoke directly to Sarah in heavily accented English. "You protect your sister, good. You have a warrior heart." Sarah's mind raced. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance. Drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed, she struggled to her feet and faced the Comanche leader. "Take me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let my sister go, and take me instead." The other warriors murmured among themselves, but Standing Bear held up a hand for silence. His eyes never left Sarah's face as he considered her offer. "Why do you trade life for a weak one?" he asked, nodding toward the unconscious Emma. "Because she's my sister," Sarah replied simply. "She's all the family I have left." Standing Bear studied her for a long moment, then spoke rapidly to his men in Comanche. The discussion that followed was heated, with several warriors gesturing emphatically toward both girls. But when the debate ended, Standing Bear's word was final. He would accept Sarah's trade, but with conditions. Emma would be taken to the settlement at Cedar Falls and left with the white settlers there. Sarah would come with the war party, not as a slave, but as something else. The word he used in Comanche had no direct English translation, but Sarah sensed it carried weight far beyond simple captivity. As the warriors prepared to leave, Sarah knelt beside her unconscious sister one last time. Emma's face was pale and drawn, but her breathing had steadied. Sarah brushed a strand of golden hair from Emma's forehead and whispered a prayer that her sister would forgive her for what she was about to do. "Tell her I love her," Sarah said to Standing Bear as two of his men lifted Emma onto a horse. "Tell her this was my choice." Standing Bear nodded solemnly. "I tell her, you brave woman. Maybe too brave for my own good." As Sarah watched her sister disappear over the eastern hills in the company of 3 Comanche warriors bound for Cedar Falls, she wondered if she would ever see Emma again. The remaining warriors were already mounted and waiting, and standing. Bear gestured for her to climb onto his horse behind him. The moment Sarah's hands grasped Standing Bear's waist, her old life ended. As they rode west toward the setting sun, she cast one last look back at the smoking ruins of her family's homestead. Somewhere in the distance, her father would soon return to find his world destroyed and his daughters gone. But Sarah McKenna was no longer thinking about the past. As the Comanche war party carried her deeper into the wilderness, toward a fate she couldn't imagine, she was already beginning to understand that her act of sacrifice had set in motion something far greater than a simple prisoner exchange. Standing Bear rode with the confident ease of a man born in the saddle, and Sarah found herself studying the powerful lines of his shoulders, the intricate beadwork on his clothing, the way he seemed to read the landscape like a familiar book. This was no savage raider, she realized. This was a leader, a man of intelligence and culture, albeit a culture completely foreign to her own. As the sun began to set and the war party made camp in a hidden valley miles from any white settlement, Sarah McKenna began to understand that her greatest challenge wouldn't be surviving captivity among the Comanche. It would be surviving the transformation that had already begun within herself. The Comanche camp sprawled across a hidden valley like a living organism, with over 200 lodges arranged in careful patterns that spoke of ancient traditions and military precision. As Standing Bear's horse descended the narrow trail leading into the valley, Sarah felt the weight of countless eyes upon her. Women emerged from their teepees, children stopped their games, and warriors paused in their tasks to stare at the white woman riding behind their war leader. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The camp buzzed with activity even as evening approached. Smoke rose from dozens of cooking fires, horses grazed in carefully tended herds, and the sound of voices speaking in rapid Comanche filled the air. But as Standing Bear's party entered the camp proper, a hush fell over the nearest lodges. Word of their arrival spread like ripples on water, and soon a crowd had gathered along their path. Standing Bear guided his horse to the center of the camp, where the largest teepee stood adorned with painted symbols and buffalo hide hangings. Here he dismounted with fluid grace, then turned to help Sarah down. His hands were surprisingly gentle as they steadied her, but she could feel the tension radiating from his body as he prepared to face whatever awaited them. An elderly woman emerged from the great lodge, her silver hair braided with beads and her weathered face bearing the kind of authority that comes only with age and wisdom. This was Singing Crow, Standing Bear's grandmother and the most respected medicine woman in the tribe. Her dark eyes swept over Sarah with penetrating intensity, taking in everything from her torn dress to her defiant posture. The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Comanche, but Sarah could read the tension in the participants' body language. Singing Crow's voice carried the sharp edge of disapproval, while Standing Bear's responses grew increasingly firm. Other tribal leaders joined the discussion, their voices rising and falling in heated debate. Sarah caught fragments of words she recognized: white woman, captive, trade, but the rapid-fire Comanche was largely incomprehensible to her. What she could understand was that her presence had created a significant controversy. Some voices seemed to support Standing Bear's decision, while others clearly opposed it. The debate continued for nearly an hour, with various tribal members weighing in on what should be done with Sarah. Throughout it all, she stood silently beside Standing Bear's horse, acutely aware that her fate was being decided by people who saw her as either a burden, a threat, or a resource to be exploited. Finally, Standing Bear raised his hand in silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of final authority, but Sarah noticed that even he glanced toward Singing Crow as he delivered what sounded like a pronouncement. The old woman's expression remained unreadable, but she gave a slight nod that seemed to settle the matter. "Come," Standing Bear said to Sarah in English, the first words he'd spoken to her since their arrival. "You stay in my grandmother's lodge. She will teach you our ways." As Sarah followed Singing Crow toward a great teepee, she became aware of the dozens of people watching her every move. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts. Young warriors whispered among themselves, and teenage girls giggled and pointed when they thought she wasn't looking. The attention was overwhelming, but Sarah forced herself to walk with dignity, knowing that any sign of weakness would be remembered. The interior of Singing Crow's lodge was surprisingly spacious and comfortable. Buffalo robes covered the floor, and the walls were decorated with painted hides depicting hunting scenes and spiritual symbols. A fire burned in the center, its smoke rising through an opening at the top of the teepee. The air was filled with the sense of sage, sweetgrass, and something else Sarah couldn't identify. Singing Crow gestured for Sarah to sit on a buffalo robe near the fire, then busied herself preparing food. Despite the language barrier, the old woman's intentions were clear. Sarah was to be fed and sheltered, at least for now. But there was nothing welcoming in Singing Crow's manner. Every movement spoke of duty rather than hospitality. As Sarah sat in the warm lodge, eating a stew of buffalo meat and wild vegetables, she tried to process everything that had happened. Less than 12 hours ago, she'd been hanging laundry behind her family's cabin. Now she was sitting in a Comanche teepee. Her sister was presumably safe in Cedar Falls, and her father would soon discover the ruins of everything he'd worked to build. The weight of her situation began to settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was alone among people who considered her their enemy, dependent on the protection of a man she barely knew, and completely cut off from everything familiar. The bravery that had sustained her during the trade with Standing Bear began to give way to a deep, bone-chilling fear. But Sarah McKenna had been raised on the frontier, where weakness was a luxury no one could afford. She forced herself to finish the meal, then helped Singing Crow clean the wooden bowls without being asked. The old woman watched her carefully, occasionally nodding approval when Sarah anticipated a need or performed the task correctly. Over the following days, Sarah's education in Comanche life began in earnest. Singing Crow proved to be a demanding teacher, expecting Sarah to learn not just the practical skills needed for survival, but the complex social customs that governed every aspect of tribal life. The language lessons were particularly challenging, as Comanche contained sounds and grammatical structures completely foreign to English. Sarah learned that the Comanche were not the savage raiders depicted in frontier newspapers, but a sophisticated people with their own laws, traditions, and codes of honor. Their society was built around the extended family unit, with complex relationships binding individuals to their clan and tribe. Warfare was important, but so were hunting, horse breeding, crafts, and spiritual practices that connected the people to the land and sky. Most surprising to Sarah was the relative freedom enjoyed by Comanche women. Unlike the rigid restrictions she'd known in white society, Comanche women could own property, express opinions in council meetings, and even initiate divorce if their marriages proved unsatisfactory. Some women, like Singing Crow herself, wielded considerable influence through their roles as medicine women or keepers of sacred traditions. Standing Bear visited his grandmother's lodge daily, ostensibly to check on Sarah's progress, but clearly for other reasons as well. During these visits, he would sit by the fire and speak with Singing Crow in rapid Comanche, occasionally glancing at Sarah with an expression she couldn't interpret. Sometimes he would address Sarah directly, testing her growing vocabulary or explaining some aspect of Comanche culture that Singing Crow had introduced. Sarah found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. Standing Bear possessed a sharp intelligence and dry sense of humor that emerged when he wasn't playing the role of war leader. He was also surprisingly well informed about white society, Having spent time as a young man trading with frontier settlements and even visiting cities like Santa Fe and St. Louis. "You think we live like animals," he said one evening as they sat around Singing Crow's fire. "But we have laws older than your grandfather's grandfather. We have songs that teach our children the history of the world. We have ceremonies that keep the balance between earth and sky." Sarah had been studying the intricate beadwork on one of Singing Crow's ceremonial dresses, marveling at the skill required to create such delicate patterns. "I'm beginning to understand that," she admitted. "My father always said Indians were uncivilized, but I see civilization everywhere I look. It's just different from what I knew." Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "Wisdom comes to those who open their eyes. Most white people see only what they expect to see." As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself adapting to Comanche life with surprising ease. Her hands grew calloused from working with buffalo hide and plant fibers. Her skin darkened from long hours in the sun. She learned to ride bareback with the skill of someone born to the saddle, and her growing fluency in Comanche allowed her to participate in the daily conversations that flowed around the camp. But adaptation came with a price. Each day that passed took her further from the world she'd known, making her former life seem increasingly remote and dreamlike. Sometimes she would catch herself thinking in Comanche phrases, or find that English words didn't come as readily as they once had. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Sarah McKenna was disappearing, replaced by someone new. The change was noticed by others in the camp as well. Women who had initially viewed her with suspicion began to include her in their work groups. Children who had once starred in fearful fascination now played games around her feet. Even some of the warriors began to nod acknowledgement when their paths crossed. But it was Standing Bear's growing attention that marked the most significant shift in Sarah's status within the tribe. His daily visits became longer and more frequent. He began seeking her opinion on matters beyond her cultural education. Most tellingly, he started bringing her small gifts, a perfectly crafted arrow, a piece of turquoise, and wildflowers gathered during his morning rides. Singing Crow watched these developments with sharp eyes and occasional cryptic comments. "My grandson sees something in you," she told Sarah one morning as they worked together preparing hides for winter clothing. "Something that makes old women worry and young women jealous." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't understand what you mean." The old woman's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Understanding will come whether you seek it or not, child. The question is what you will do when it arrives." The first snow of winter arrived earlier than expected, blanketing the hidden valley in pristine white that transformed the Comanche camp into something from a dream. Sarah woke to the sound of children's laughter echoing across the frozen landscape as they played in the powdery drifts that had accumulated overnight. Through the smoke hole of Singing Crow's lodge, she could see a sky the color of burnished silver, heavy with the promise of more snow to come. Winter among the Comanche proved to be a time of storytelling, craft-making, and deep spiritual preparation. With hunting limited by weather and travel restricted by snowdrifts, the tribe turned inward, strengthening the bonds that would carry them through the harsh months ahead. Sarah found herself drawn into activities she could never have imagined. During her former life, helping to tan the thick winter buffalo robes, participating in the complex beadwork that decorated ceremonial clothing, and learning the ancient songs that preserved tribal history. It was during one of these long winter evenings that Sarah first heard the story of Standing Bear's vision quest. The tale was told by Gray Wolf, the oldest warrior in the tribe, whose weathered hands moved in graceful gestures as he spoke in the musical cadences of traditional Comanche storytelling. Sarah's language skills had progressed enough that she could follow most of the narrative, though Singing Crow occasionally whispered translations of particularly difficult passages. The story told of a young Standing Bear, barely 18 years old, who had ventured alone into the sacred mountains seeking guidance from the spirits. For 4 days and 4 nights, he had fasted and prayed, waiting for the vision that would reveal his true path in life. On the 4th night, as Standing Bear lay weakened by hunger and exposure on a windswept plateau, the spirits had come to him in the form of a great golden eagle. But this eagle was unlike any bird he had ever seen. Its feathers shimmered with an inner light, and when it spoke, its voice carried the wisdom of all his ancestors. The eagle had shown Standing Bear visions of his future. He would become a great war leader, respected by his enemies and beloved by his people. He would face many trials, including a great choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of his entire tribe. And in the end, he would find his strength not in warfare or conquest, but in the courage to embrace something completely unexpected. As Gray Wolf concluded the story, Sarah became aware that many eyes in the circle were focused on her. The implication was clear. Though never explicitly stated, Standing Bear's vision quest had somehow prepared him for her arrival. She was not just a captive or even a welcome guest, but a fulfillment of ancient prophecy. The weight of this realization was almost overwhelming. Sarah had grown up in a world where women's choices were limited and their destinies largely determined by the men in their lives. Now she found herself cast as a central figure in what appeared to be a spiritual drama of cosmic proportions. Standing Bear himself seemed to sense her discomfort with this role. The next morning, he appeared at Singing Crow's lodge with 2 horses saddled and ready for travel. Despite the snow that continued to fall in gentle spirals, he invited Sarah to accompany him on what he called a learning ride into the winter landscape. They rode in comfortable silence through the snow-muffled forest, following animal trails that wound between towering pines and across frozen streams. Standing Bear pointed out signs that Sarah was learning to read: the track of a deer barely visible in the soft snow, the territorial markings left by a mountain lion on a prominent boulder, the subtle changes in wind direction that indicated approaching weather. Eventually, they arrived at a high meadow that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. Here, Standing Bear dismounted and began clearing snow from a natural windbreak formed by fallen logs. Soon he had a small fire burning, and they sat warming their hands while their horses pawed through the snow to reach the dried grass beneath. "You are troubled by Gray Wolf's story," Standing Bear said, speaking in English for the first time in weeks. His command of the language had clearly improved through their conversations. Though he still chose his words carefully, Sarah considered her response, knowing that this conversation might determine the entire future course of her life among the Comanche. "I'm honored that your people think I might be part of something important," she said finally. "But I'm also frightened by the responsibility. What if I'm not who you think I am? What if I disappoint everyone?" Standing Bear poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the gray sky. "In my vision, the eagle told me that strength comes not from being perfect, but from choosing to do what is right even when the path is unclear. You have already shown this strength when you traded yourself for your sister's freedom." "That wasn't strength," Sarah protested. "That was desperation. I was terrified." "Fear and courage are not enemies," Standing Bear replied. "They are partners in the dance of life. The bravest warriors are those who act despite their fear, not those who feel no fear at all." As they sat by the fire watching the snow fall, Standing Bear began to tell Sarah about his own fears and uncertainties. He spoke of the pressure he felt as a young leader trying to guide his people through increasingly difficult times. White settlers were pushing further west each year. The army was becoming more aggressive in its campaigns against the tribes, and traditional ways of life were being threatened by forces beyond anyone's control. "My father and his father could solve their problems with warfare," Standing Bear explained. "If enemies threatened us, we fought them. If we needed horses or weapons, we raided for them. But the world is changing faster than an old man's wisdom can follow. Now we must find new ways to survive, new ways to preserve what matters most to us." Sarah began to understand that her presence in the camp represented more than just the fulfillment of a personal vision quest. In a world where the old certainties were crumbling, she embodied the possibility of adaptation, of finding strength through embracing change rather than resisting it. Over the following weeks, Standing Bear began including Sarah in discussions about tribal governance and future planning. She found herself sitting in council meetings where matters of war and peace were debated, her growing fluency in Comanche allowing her to follow complex political discussions. Her opinions were sought on questions ranging from trade relationships with other tribes to strategies for dealing with increasing pressure from white authorities. Sarah's unique perspective, someone who understood both worlds but belonged fully to neither, proved valuable in ways she had never anticipated. She could explain white motivations and methods in terms that made sense to Comanche leaders, while also helping them develop responses that honored tribal traditions while adapting to new realities. But it was her growing relationship with Standing Bear that truly began to transform her status within the tribe. What had begun as protector and protected evolved into something deeper and more complex. They were becoming partners in the truest sense, two people whose different backgrounds and perspectives complemented each other in powerful ways. The change was noticed by everyone in the camp, but nowhere more clearly than in Singing Crow's increasingly knowing looks and cryptic observations. The old medicine woman had begun treating Sarah less like a student and more like a granddaughter-in-law, teaching her the sacred songs and ceremonies that were normally reserved for women born into the tribe. "Winter is ending," Singing Crow observed one morning as they worked together preparing medicines from dried roots and herbs. "Soon the snow will melt, the grass will grow green, and young hearts will make choices that cannot be unmade." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of choices?" Singing Crow's weathered hands never paused in their work, but her smile held depths of meaning that Sarah was only beginning to fathom. The kind that turns captives into queens' children. The kind that changes the world. Spring arrived in the hidden valley like a whispered promise, bringing with it changes that would test every bond Sarah had forged during her months among the Comanche. The ice on the creek broke with thunderous cracks that echoed off the canyon walls, sending torrents of snowmelt rushing toward the distant plains. Wildflowers painted the meadows in brilliant purples and yellows, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with renewed life. But with the warming weather came troubling news from the outside world. Runners arrived almost daily with reports that made the tribal council meetings grow longer and more heated. A new military commander had been assigned to Fort Riley, a man named Colonel Harrison Blackwood, whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. Blackwood had already conducted 3 successful campaigns against Kiowa and Cheyenne bands, and intelligence suggested he was now turning his attention to the Comanche. Even more disturbing were the reports of white settlers flooding into territories that had been promised to the tribes in previous treaties. Entire wagon trains were establishing permanent settlements in areas where no white man was supposed to set foot, protected by army units that claimed to be there for temporary security purposes. Sarah found herself in an increasingly difficult position as these tensions escalated. Her knowledge of white military tactics and settler mentality made her invaluable to the tribal council, but it also marked her as different, as someone whose ultimate loyalties might still be questioned. Some of the younger warriors began to look at her with suspicion, wondering aloud why they should trust the advice of someone whose own people were threatening their way of life. The situation came to a head during a particularly intense council meeting in late April. Windrider, a hot-headed warrior in his 20s who had been vocal in his opposition to Sarah's presence, stood before the assembled leaders and delivered an impassioned speech about the dangers of allowing enemies to influence tribal decisions. "She may speak our language and wear our clothes," Windrider declared, his voice carrying across the council circle, "but her blood is white, and white blood calls to white blood." How do we know she is not sending signals to her people? How do we know she has not already told them where to find us? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a bitter fire. Sarah felt every eye in the circle turn toward her, and she understood that this moment would determine not just her immediate fate, but the entire future course of her life among the Comanche. Standing Bear's expression remained carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested near his knife. Singing Crow was the first to speak, her ancient voice cutting through the charged atmosphere with the authority of age and wisdom. "Wind Rider speaks from fear, not knowledge," she said, rising slowly to her feet. "I have watched this woman for many moons. I have seen her heart through her actions. She chose to sacrifice herself for her sister. She has learned our ways not as a spy learns to deceive, but as a daughter learns to belong." Other voices joined the debate, some supporting Wind Rider's suspicions, others defending Sarah's character and contributions. The discussion grew heated, with old grievances and cultural divisions being aired alongside the immediate question of Sarah's loyalty. Finally, Standing Bear rose to address the council. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the tone of a war leader who would not be challenged. "Wind Rider asks how we can trust one whose blood is different from ours," Standing Bear said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled warriors and elders. "I ask this: how many of us can claim that all our ancestors were Comanche? How many of our grandmothers were not taken from other tribes and made part of our people? The strength of the Comanche has always come from our ability to make family from strangers, to find warriors among our former enemies." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But Wind Rider deserves an answer to his question. He asks for proof of loyalty. Very well. I propose a test that will settle this matter once and for all." The test Standing Bear proposed was both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. 3 days hence, a small party of Comanche warriors would ride to the edge of White Territory and establish a temporary camp visible from the main travel routes. If Sarah was indeed a spy, this would be her opportunity to escape and warn the soldiers of the tribe's location. If she remained loyal, if she chose to stay with the Comanche even when given the chance to return to her own people, then no one could question her commitment. Sarah felt her heart hammering as she listened to the details of the test. This was the moment she had known would come eventually, the moment when she would have to choose definitively between two worlds, two peoples, two entirely different futures. The 3 days that followed were among the most difficult of Sarah's life. She found herself analyzing every aspect of her existence among the Comanche, weighing what she had gained against what she had lost. The freedom to think and speak as an equal, the deep spiritual connection to the natural world, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. These were gifts she had never experienced in white society. But there were losses too, and she felt them keenly. Her father, who by now certainly believed both his daughters were dead. Emma, who might be wondering every day whether her sister was still alive. The familiar rhythms of the life she had known, the customs and traditions that had shaped her from childhood. Standing Bear seemed to understand her internal struggle without needing it explained. On the evening before the test, he found her sitting alone by the creek, watching the water flow endlessly toward the distant horizon. "You are thinking of your family," he said, settling beside her on the grassy bank. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "I wonder if Emma thinks about me, if she blames me for leaving her alone." "She does not blame you," Standing Bear said with quiet certainty. "Sisters understand sacrifice in ways that others cannot. She knows you saved her life." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the camp behind them and the gentle murmur of the water. Finally, Standing Bear spoke again, his voice careful and measured. "There is something I must tell you before tomorrow comes," he said. Something that may change how you see this choice you must make. Sarah turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. The test was my idea, but not for the reasons the council believes, Standing Bear continued. I know you are loyal. I have known it since the day you offered your life for your sister's freedom. But there are others who need to see proof, and there are traditions that must be honored before certain things can happen. What things? Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Standing Bear reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that glittered in the moonlight, a necklace of silver and turquoise, worked in patterns that spoke of master craftsmanship and deep cultural significance. Among my people, when a warrior wishes to take a wife, he must prove that she chooses him freely, not from fear or necessity, he explained, his fingers tracing the intricate metalwork. The woman must demonstrate her commitment to his people, his way of life, his future. Only then can the sacred bonds be formed. Sarah stared at the necklace, understanding flooding through her like sunlight breaking through clouds. This test wasn't about proving her loyalty to the tribe. It was about proving her readiness to become Standing Bear's wife, to take her place, not just as an adopted member of the Comanche, but as the partner of their future chief. You're asking me to marry you, she said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. I am asking you to choose, Standing Bear replied. To choose not just between white and Comanche, but between the woman you were and the woman you could become. Tomorrow, when the test comes, you will decide not just your own fate, but ours together. The weight of the decision settled over Sarah like a physical presence. This wasn't just about loyalty or survival anymore, it was about love. About the kind of transformative partnership that could reshape two lives and possibly two cultures. Morning of the test arrived gray and cool, with low clouds promising rain before nightfall. The party that rode out from the hidden valley consisted of 8 warriors, including Standing Bear and Wind Rider, along with Sarah herself. They traveled in silence across the rolling prairie, each member of the group lost in their own thoughts about what the day might bring. By mid-afternoon, they had reached their destination, a low hill overlooking the main trail that connected Fort Riley to the growing settlement at Cedar Falls. From their vantage point, they could see the dust clouds raised by passing wagon trains and the occasional patrol of cavalry soldiers. As they made camp in plain sight of the traveled route, Sarah realized that several of the warriors were watching her with barely concealed tension. Wind Rider in particular seemed to be expecting her to make some move toward escape, his hand never straying far from his weapons. But as the hours passed and Sarah made no attempt to leave, helped gather firewood, and participated in the normal routines of camp life, the atmosphere gradually began to relax. When evening came and she settled by the fire with the others, sharing dried meat and parched corn as if this were any ordinary night, even Wind Rider began to look puzzled rather than suspicious. It was Standing Bear who finally addressed what everyone was thinking. The test is complete, he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. She has had the opportunity to escape, to return to her people, to seek help from the soldiers who patrol this road. Instead, she chooses to remain with us. Let no one question her loyalty again. Wind Rider nodded slowly, his earlier hostility replaced by what looked like grudging respect. I spoke from fear, he admitted. I have seen too many friends die from white man's bullets. But I was wrong to doubt one who has proven herself in deed as well as word. As the other warriors murmured their agreement, Standing Bear moved to sit beside Sarah. Without speaking, he placed the silver and turquoise necklace in her hands, letting her feel the weight of what it represented. The choice is still yours, he said quietly, speaking in English so that their conversation would remain private. But if you accept this, you accept everything it means. You become not just my wife, but a leader among our people. You help guide our future in whatever struggles lie ahead. Sarah looked down at the necklace, then up at Standing Bear's face, illuminated by the dancing firelight. In his eyes she saw not just love, but partnership, equality, and the promise of a life lived on terms she had never imagined possible. Around them, the other warriors were preparing for sleep, spreading their blankets and checking their weapons, with the casual efficiency of men accustomed to sleeping under the stars. Tomorrow they would return to the hidden valley, and Sarah would face the entire tribe as Standing Bear's chosen partner. But tonight, as she fastened the necklace around her throat and felt its weight settle against her skin, Sarah McKenna made her final transformation. The frightened frontier girl who had offered herself in trade for her sister's freedom was gone forever, replaced by someone new, someone who had chosen love over fear, growth over safety, and an uncertain but extraordinary future over the familiar. Limitations of the past. When Standing Bear took her hand in his, Sarah squeezed back with fingers that no longer trembled. She had made her choice, and for the first time since that terrible morning when the war party had descended on her family's homestead, she felt completely, unshakably certain that she had chosen correctly. The wedding preparations began before dawn on the day of their return to the hidden valley. Singing Crow had awakened the entire camp with her joyful ululations, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls and announced to every living creature that momentous events were unfolding. By the time Standing Bear's party crested the final ridge, overlooking their home, smoke was already rising from dozens of celebration fires, and the sound of drums carried on the morning air. Sarah felt her breath catch as she saw the transformation that had taken place in their absence. The entire camp had been reorganized for celebration, with the largest ceremonial area cleared and decorated with painted buffalo hides, strings of beads, and arrangements of spring flowers that must have taken hundreds of people working together to gather and arrange. But it was the crowd of people waiting to greet them that truly demonstrated the significance of this moment. Every member of the tribe seemed to be present, from the oldest grandmothers to babies carried in their mothers' arms. Warriors who had been out on distant hunting expeditions had somehow received word and returned in time for the ceremony. Even representatives from allied bands had arrived, their distinct clothing and tribal markings showing that news of Standing Bear's choice had spread far beyond their immediate community. As their small party descended into the valley, Sarah became acutely aware that she was no longer simply a white woman who had found acceptance among the Comanche. She was about to become the wife of their future chief, a position that would make her one of the most powerful women in the entire Confederation of Southern Plains tribes. The enormity of this responsibility might have been overwhelming, but Sarah found herself drawing strength from the weight of the silver and turquoise necklace at her throat. Each time she touched it, she remembered Standing Bear's words about choosing not just between two worlds, but between who she had been and who she could become. The formal welcome ceremony took place in the center of the camp, with the entire tribe arranged in concentric circles around Standing Bear and Sarah, the current chief. Standing Bear's father, Thunder Horse, spoke first, his weathered voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd as he formally recognized Sarah's choice to remain with the tribe, despite the opportunity to escape. "She has shown that her heart beats with Comanche blood," Thunder Horse declared, raising his ceremonial staff toward the sky. "She has proven that loyalty is not a matter of birth, but of choice. From this day forward, let no one call her white woman. She is our daughter, our sister, our future mother of warriors." The response from the crowd was immediate and thunderous war. Cries, ululations, and the rhythmic pounding of feet against the earth that made the very ground seem to pulse with collective energy. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized that this was more than just acceptance. This was adoption in the deepest spiritual sense, a formal recognition that she had become truly Comanche in every way that mattered. But the most profound moment came when Singing Crow approached carrying a bundle wrapped in sacred white buckskin. As the old medicine woman unfolded the covering, Sarah gasped at what lay within a complete set of traditional wedding garments, more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. The dress itself was made from the softest doeskin, dyed a pale cream color and decorated with thousands of tiny beads, arranged in patterns that told the story of Standing Bear's lineage and achievements. The beadwork depicted eagles in flight, buffalo running across endless plains, and sacred symbols that connected the wearer to all the forces of earth and sky. Matching moccasins were decorated with similar motifs, and a ceremonial belt of silver Concos completed the ensemble. "These belong to my grandmother, and her grandmother before her," Singing Crow explained as she helped Sarah into the garments. Each woman who wore them added her own touches, her own prayers woven into the beadwork. "Now you will add yours, and someday your daughter will continue the tradition." As the women of the tribe worked together to prepare Sarah for the ceremony, she found herself surrounded by a community of support unlike anything she had experienced in her former life. Elder women shared stories of their own wedding days. Young mothers offered advice about married life, and even teenage girls contributed by weaving flowers into Sarah's hair and painting traditional designs on her face with sacred clays. Transformation was remarkable. When Sarah finally saw her reflection in a polished metal mirror, she barely recognized herself. The nervous white girl who had arrived in the camp as a captive had been replaced by a confident Comanche woman ready to take her place as a leader's wife. Meanwhile, Standing Bear was undergoing his own preparations on the opposite side of the camp. According to tradition, the bride and groom could not see each other from sunrise until the moment they were formally joined, a period of separation that was said to make their reunion all the more powerful. Sarah used this time to participate in the women's ceremonies that preceded the wedding itself. These rituals, some of them so ancient that their origins were lost in tribal memory, were designed to prepare her spiritually for the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood. She learned sacred songs that wives sang to ensure their husband's safety in battle, participated in blessing ceremonies that would protect her future children, and received instruction in the complex protocols that governed a chief's wife's interactions with other tribal members. The most moving of these ceremonies took place in Singing Crow's lodge, just as the sun reached its zenith. Sarah knelt on a buffalo robe while the medicine woman painted sacred symbols on her forehead with a mixture of clay and crushed herbs, each mark representing a different aspect of her new identity. "You are no longer the frightened girl who traded herself for her sister's freedom," Singing Crow intoned as she worked. "You are a bright star woman, she who brings light to dark places, she who shows new paths when old ways no longer serve. This is the name the spirits have given you, and this is who you will be among our people." The name resonated through Sarah's entire being like the sound of a perfectly struck bell. Bright Star Woman, it captured something essential about her journey, her role as a bridge between worlds, her potential to illuminate new possibilities for both peoples. As the afternoon wore on, the camp's excitement continued to build. Musicians tuned their drums and flutes, dancers practiced traditional steps, and the cooks prepare an enormous feast that would feed hundreds of people late into the night. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation and joy. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the formal wedding ceremony commenced. Sarah, now Bright Star Woman, was escorted to the ceremonial area by a procession of tribal elders, her path strewn with flower petals and sweet-smelling herbs. The crowd parted before her like water, and she could feel the weight of countless eyes following her progress toward the elaborately decorated wedding bower that had been constructed in the center of the circle. Standing Bear was already waiting for her there, resplendent in his own ceremonial clothing. His chest was painted with symbols of his war honors and spiritual achievements, and his long black hair was woven with eagle feathers that marked his status as a war leader. But it was his expression that took Sarah's breath away, a mixture of love, pride, and wonder that made her feel as if she were the most precious thing in the entire world. The ceremony itself was unlike any wedding Sarah had ever witnessed. Instead of a single officiant, multiple spiritual leaders took turns conducting different portions of the ritual, each one addressing different aspects of marriage from Comanche perspective. There were blessings for fertility and abundance, prayers for protection in times of danger, and invocations of the spirits that would guide the couple through whatever challenges lay ahead. The exchange of vows was particularly meaningful, as both bride and groom spoke not just to each other, but to the entire assembled tribe. Standing There's words were simple but profound, delivered in Comanche that Sarah now understood perfectly. "I take this woman not as my possession, but as my partner," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed crowd. "Together, we will face whatever storms may come. Together, we will make decisions that affect our people's future. Together, we will raise children who honor both tradition and change." When it came time for Sarah to speak, she felt the weight of hundreds of years of tribal tradition flowing through her words. "I choose to be Comanche not because I must, but because my heart calls me to this people, this way of life, this man who sees strength where others see difference. I promise to serve our tribe with wisdom, to raise our children with pride in their heritage, and to stand beside my husband as an equal in all things." The formal joining was accomplished through a series of symbolic acts that bound the couple together in the eyes of both human and spiritual witnesses. They drank from the same ceremonial cup, shared food that represented the abundance they would create together, and finally had their hands bound with strips of sacred buckskin, while the tribal elders chanted blessings that were said to ensure a lifetime of happiness and prosperity. As the sun set and the evening stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the celebration truly began. The feast that followed included every delicacy the plains could provide: roasted buffalo, venison cooked with wild onions and herbs, fresh fish from the mountain streams, and an array of cakes and puddings made from wild berries and nuts. Singers performed traditional wedding songs, while dancers reenacted the stories of legendary couples whose love had become part of tribal mythology. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Thunder Horse formally announced his intention to step down as chief within the year, passing leadership to his son and daughter-in-law. The declaration sent ripples of excitement through the crowd, as everyone understood that they were witnessing not just a wedding, but the beginning of a new era for their people. "Standing Bear has shown wisdom in his choice of partner," Old Chief proclaimed, gesturing toward the newlyweds. "Bright Star Woman brings gifts our people will need in the difficult times ahead. She understands both worlds, speaks both languages, and sees possibilities that eyes trained only in the old ways might miss. Together, they will lead us through whatever changes the future may bring." As the celebration continued deep into the Fey night, Sarah found herself moving through the crowd in a kind of joyful daze. Everywhere she turned, people pressed forward to offer congratulations, gifts, and words of welcome. Children who had once stared at her with curious fear now tugged at her dress, seeking attention and treats. Warriors who had initially viewed her with suspicion now spoke to her with respect, due to their future chief's wife. But it was the women's responses that touched her most deeply. Elder grandmothers shared stories of their own marriages and offered advice about the challenges and joys of life as a tribal leader's wife. Young mothers brought their babies to receive blessings from the new bride. Even teenage girls, shy but excited, asked questions about what it meant to choose love over safety, adventure over security. Through it all, Standing Bear remained at her side, his hand never leaving hers, his pride in her evident to everyone who saw them together. When the formal ceremonies finally concluded, and they were escorted to their new lodge, a magnificent structure that had been constructed and furnished by the entire tribe as their wedding gift, Sarah felt as if she were walking into a completely new life. The lodge itself was a masterpiece of Comanche craftsmanship, larger and more elaborate than any dwelling she had seen in the camp. The walls were decorated with painted buffalo hides, depicting the great moments in Standing Bear's family history, while the furnishings represented the finest work of the tribe's best artists and craftsmen. But what moved Sarah most were the personal touches, gifts from individual tribal members that showed how completely she had been accepted into their community. As Standing Bear extinguished the last of the celebration fires outside and joined her in their new home, Sarah felt the final pieces of her transformation falling into place. She was no longer Sarah McKenna, the frontier farmer's daughter who had sacrificed herself to save her sister. She was a bright star woman, wife of a future chief, destined to help guide an entire people through the turbulent years ahead. The frightened girl, who had hidden behind an overturned wagon, was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found her true strength, not in resistance to change, but in embracing it completely. The first test of Bright Star Women's new role came sooner than anyone had anticipated. Just 3 weeks after the wedding celebration, scouts arrived with news that would challenge everything she and Standing Bear had hoped to build together. Colonel Blackwood's forces were moving west in unprecedented numbers, accompanied by surveyor teams and civilian administrators whose presence could only mean one thing. The government intended to establish permanent control over territories that had been Comanche homeland for generations. Even more alarming was the report that Emma McKenna had been seen among the civilian party, traveling under the protection of a cavalry escort and apparently serving as some kind of interpreter or cultural liaison. The irony was bitter and sharp. Sarah's sister, the one she had sacrificed everything to save, was now potentially being used as a weapon against her. Adopted people. The tribal council that convened to address this crisis was unlike any that had come before. For the first time in Comanche history, a white woman, even one who had been fully adopted into the tribe, sat among the war chiefs and elders as an equal voice in determining their people's fate. Some of the older warriors still struggled with this change, but Standing Bear's unwavering support for his wife's participation made resistance impossible. Bright Star Woman's analysis of the situation proved invaluable. She understood Colonel Blackwood's reputation and methods in ways that purely Comanche perspectives could not match. The man was not just another army officer seeking glory through warfare. He was a strategic thinker who planned campaigns months, or even years in advance. His current movement was almost certainly the opening phase of a larger operation designed to force all the southern plains tribes onto reservations. "He will not attack us directly at first," Bright Star Woman explained to the assembled council, her fluent Comanche making her insights accessible to every member. "Blackwood prefers to isolate his enemies, cutting them off from allies and supply sources before striking the final blow. He will try to turn the other tribes against us, offer them better terms for surrender in exchange for information about our movements and strongholds." Wind Rider, who had become one of her strongest supporters since the loyalty test, leaned forward with interest. "What would you advise? Should we strike first, before he can complete these preparations?" Bright Star Woman exchanged glances with Standing Bear before responding. They had discussed this possibility privately, exploring options that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of Comanche leaders. "There is another path," she said carefully, knowing that her next words would either be seen as wisdom or betrayal. "We could arrange a meeting. Use my knowledge of white customs and Standing Bear's authority to negotiate from a position of strength rather than desperation." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several warriors leaped to their feet, voices raised in outrage at the suggestion of negotiating with their enemies. Thunder Horse himself looked shocked that his daughter-in-law would propose such a radical departure from traditional Comanche responses to threats, but Standing Bear raised his hand for silence, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Explain what you see that we do not," he said, giving Bright Star Woman the opportunity to elaborate on what sounded like surrender, but might be something else entirely. The old ways of fighting worked when we faced small groups of settlers or isolated army units, she continued, her voice steady despite the tension in the lodge. But Blackwood commands thousands of soldiers, with more arriving every month. He has repeating rifles, artillery, and supply lines that stretch back to the great cities of the East. If we fight him as our fathers fought their enemies, we will lose everything. She paused, letting this harsh reality sink in before presenting her alternative. But if we meet him as equals, as representatives of a sovereign people, we might be able to secure terms that preserve what matters most to us. Our children's future, our spiritual practices, our right to live according to our own laws in at least part of our ancestral lands. The debate that followed lasted through the night and well into the next day. Traditional war chiefs argued passionately for immediate resistance, while younger leaders began to see the logic in Bright Star Women's approach. Standing Bear himself seemed torn between his warrior's instincts and his growing understanding that the world had changed in ways that made old solutions inadequate. The deadlock was finally broken by an unexpected voice, Gray Wolf, the ancient storyteller whose age and wisdom commanded universal respect. The old man had listened to the arguments in silence, but now he struggled to his feet and addressed the council with words that would be remembered for generations. "I have lived through 8 decades of fighting," Gray Wolf said, his weathered voice carrying clearly through the hushed lodge. "I have seen brave warriors die for causes both noble and foolish. I have watched our people adapt to horses, to guns, to changes that our grandfathers could never have imagined. Now comes the greatest change of all, and we must choose between the courage of the warrior and the wisdom of the survivor." He turned to look directly at Bright Star Woman, his ancient eyes holding depths of understanding that seemed to encompass all of human history. "This woman came to us as a captive, but chose to become our daughter. She speaks not from fear of fighting, but from knowledge of what fighting against impossible odds will cost our children's children. I say we listen to her wisdom and see what can be preserved through words before we lose everything through war." Gray Wolf's endorsement shifted the balance decisively. Within hours, the council had authorized Standing Bear and Bright Star Woman to arrange a meeting with Colonel Blackwood, using Emma Messina as an intermediary if necessary. The logistics of arranging such a meeting proved complex and dangerous. Any direct contact with Blackwood's forces risked being seen as surrender or weakness, while failure to establish communication could result in a devastating surprise attack. Eventually, they settled on a plan that would use Bright Star Woman's unique position to their advantage. She would approach the cavalry column alone, under a flag of truce, and request a meeting with her sister. This reunion would provide cover for delivering Standing Bear's proposal for formal negotiations between equals to sovereign people seeking to resolve their differences through diplomacy rather than bloodshed. The morning of the approach dawned, clear and cold, with frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Bright Star Woman had chosen her clothing carefully traditional, Comanche dress that would establish her identity and allegiances, but also the silver and turquoise necklace that marked her status as Standing Bear's wife and partner in leadership. As she rode across the prairie toward the distant column of soldiers and wagons, Bright Star Woman reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been Sarah McKenna, a frightened frontier girl whose greatest ambition was to survive each day and protect her younger sister. Now she was riding to meet a United States Army colonel as the representative of a sovereign nation, carrying the hopes and fears of an entire people on her shoulders. The cavalry escort that rode out to meet her was led by a young lieutenant, whose nervous energy suggested he had never encountered anything quite like this situation. Behind him, Bright Star Woman could see a familiar figure mounted on a bay mare, Emma, looking older and more serious than she remembered, but unmistakably her beloved sister. The reunion was emotional but brief, conducted under the watchful eyes of a dozen soldiers and several civilian officials. Emma's tears were genuine as she embraced the sister she had thought lost forever. But Bright Star Woman could sense the complicated mixture of relief, confusion, and disapproval in her sister's reaction to her transformed appearance and circumstances. "Sarah," Emma whispered, using the old name like a prayer. "We thought you were dead. Father searched for months before the grief killed him. I've been trying to find you ever since." The news of their father's death hit Bright Star Woman like a physical blow, but she forced herself to maintain composure. This was not the time for personal grief. Too much depended on the success of her mission. "I am sorry about Father," she said quietly. "But I am no longer Sarah. I am Bright Star Woman, wife of Standing Bear, and I speak for the Comanche people." Emma's face showed shock and something that might have been betrayal. "You can't mean that. You're white, Sarah. These people are our enemies. Colonel Blackwood says they're savages who—" "Colonel Blackwood is wrong," Bright Star Woman interrupted firmly. "And if you truly want to prevent bloodshed, you'll help me arrange a meeting where he can learn the truth." The negotiations that followed were delicate and complex, involving multiple levels of protocol and military hierarchy. Colonel Blackwood proved to be exactly what Bright Star Woman had expected: intelligent, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own cultural superiority. But he was also pragmatic enough to recognize an opportunity when he saw one. The formal meeting took place 3 days later in a neutral location, a natural amphitheater formed by low hills that provided security for both parties while allowing for the kind of ceremonial display that would satisfy Comanche requirements for proper diplomatic protocol. Standing Bear arrived with a carefully chosen delegation of 20 warriors and elders, all mounted on their finest horses and dressed in full regalia that demonstrated the wealth and power of their people. Bright Star Woman rode at his side, her presence serving as both translator and living symbol of the cultural bridge that made these negotiations possible. Colonel Blackwood's party was equally impressive: uniformed officers representing the might of the United States military, civilian officials with the authority to negotiate on behalf of the territorial government, and a small escort of cavalry that suggested confidence rather than fear. The discussions that followed were unlike anything in the history of white Indian relations on the southern plains. Instead of the usual pattern of threats, ultimatums, and broken promises, both sides engaged in genuine diplomatic dialogue. Standing Bear presented the Comanche position with dignity and intelligence that clearly surprised the white officials, while Blackwood responded with a respect that acknowledged his opponents as worthy adversaries rather than inferior savages. Bright Star Woman's role as interpreter proved crucial, but not just for language translation. She was able to explain cultural concepts and motivations that would have been lost in purely literal communication, helping both sides understand not just what the other was saying, but why they were saying it. The breakthrough came when Standing Bear proposed something that had never been attempted before: a formal treaty that would recognize Comanche sovereignty over a reduced but clearly defined territory, in exchange for guarantees of safe passage for settlers and military forces traveling through their lands to California and Oregon. "We do not ask to stop the movement of your people toward the setting sun," Standing Bear explained through Bright Star Woman's translation. "We ask only for the right to remain who we are in the places that are sacred to us. Let there be roads for your wagons and boundaries for our buffalo. Let our children learn your writing while keeping our songs. Let us be neighbors instead of enemies." The negotiations continued for 6 days, with both sides making compromises that would have been unthinkable under different circumstances. The treaty that emerged was far from perfect, but it offered something that neither side could achieve through warfare alone: a future that preserved essential elements of both cultures while acknowledging the realities of a changing world. For the Comanche, it meant accepting significant restrictions on their traditional nomadic lifestyle, while gaining recognition as a legitimate political entity with the right to self-governance within agreed-upon boundaries. For the United States, it meant acknowledging that westward expansion could proceed through negotiation and mutual benefit rather than conquest and extermination. The ceremony that formalized the treaty was conducted according to both Comanche and white traditions, with sacred pipes and signed documents carrying equal weight in establishing the bonds between peoples. As Bright Star Woman watched Standing Bear and Colonel Blackwood clasp hands in the ancient gesture of alliance, she understood that her journey from captive to queen had created something unprecedented in the history of two cultures, but perhaps the most meaningful moment came during her final conversation with Emma. Her sister had watched the proceedings with growing understanding, and her attitude toward Bright Star Woman's choices had gradually shifted from disapproval to amazement. "I still don't entirely understand how you could choose this life over coming home with me," Emma admitted as they walked together along the creek that bordered the meeting ground. "But I can see that you're happy here. More than happy, you're powerful in ways I never imagined possible." Bright Star Woman smiled, remembering the frightened girl who had hidden behind an overturned wagon while raiders destroyed her world. "I didn't choose this life," she said. "I chose love and courage and the willingness to become someone I never knew I could be. Life chose me." As the two parties prepared to depart, Standing Bear and Bright Star Woman rode back toward their hidden valley carrying more than just a signed treaty. They carried the hopes of their people for a future that honored the past while embracing necessary change. The young woman who had traded herself for her sister's freedom had become the queen she was always meant to be, not through conquest or inheritance, but through the kind of courage that transforms not just individuals, but entire peoples. The Hidden Valley welcomed them home with celebration fires and songs of victory, but Bright Star Woman knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The treaty was just the beginning of a transformation that would test every aspect of Comanche society. She and Standing Bear would need all their combined wisdom to guide their people through the changes that were coming. But as she sat by the fire in their lodge that night, feeling Standing Bear's strong arm around her shoulders and listening to the sound of children playing outside, Bright Star Woman knew that she had found her true destiny. She had become exactly who she was meant to be, a bridge between worlds, a queen who ruled through love rather than fear, and a woman who had discovered that the greatest freedom comes not from holding on to the past, but from having the courage to create an entirely new future. 2 years had passed since the treaty signing, and the changes it brought to Comanche life were both profound and challenging. The Hidden Valley had been transformed from a secret refuge into the administrative center of what was now officially recognized as the Comanche Nation. New lodges had been constructed to house the growing number of tribal members who had relocated from scattered bands across the territory, and permanent structures had been built to serve functions that nomadic life had never required. Bright Star Woman stood on the hill overlooking the expanded settlement, her hand resting on her swollen belly where her first child grew. The pregnancy had been announced at the autumn council meeting, and the entire tribe had celebrated the news as a sign that the spirits approved of the new path they had chosen. But with her condition came new responsibilities and concerns that tested her leadership in ways she had never anticipated. The morning brought its usual stream of petitioners, seeking her counsel on matters both large and small. As Standing Bear's wife and now the recognized co-leader of their people, Bright Star Woman had become the final arbiter of disputes that ranged from disagreements over grazing rights to complex questions about how traditional laws should be applied in their rapidly changing society. Her first visitor was Blue Hawk, a young warrior whose frustration with the treaty's restrictions had been growing more vocal with each passing month. He arrived at her lodge accompanied by several like-minded companions, their expressions grim as they requested permission to speak privately with her. "Bright Star Woman," Blue Hawk began, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "we come to you because we believe you still remember what it means to be Comanche. The treaty you helped negotiate may have prevented war, but it has also caged us like animals in the white man's traveling shows. Bright Star Woman gestured for the young men to sit, recognizing that this conversation would require all her diplomatic skills. Blue Hawk represented a growing faction within the tribe, mostly younger warriors, who had never known life before the treaty and chafed under its restrictions on raiding, hunting in certain areas, and traditional expressions of martial prowess. "Speak your concerns openly," she said, settling onto a buffalo robe despite the awkwardness of her pregnancy. "I will listen without judgment." Blue Hawk's companion, a fierce-looking young man named Striking Wolf, leaned forward eagerly. "The white settlers grow bolder every month, grazing their cattle on lands that were promised to remain ours. Their military patrols treat us like children who must ask permission to travel beyond our own boundaries. And now they want to send teachers to establish a school where our children will learn to read their words while forgetting our songs." The school issue had indeed become a source of heated debate within the tribal council. The treaty included provisions for education, but the specifics had been left deliberately vague to allow for later negotiation. Now federal officials were pressing for the establishment of a formal schoolhouse with white teachers, while many Comanche parents feared this would represent the first step toward complete cultural assimilation. "You speak as if these are simple problems with simple solutions," Bright Star Woman replied carefully. "Tell me, what would you have us do? Break the treaty and return to the old ways of warfare?" Blue Hawk's eyes flashed with something that might have been hope. "Why not? Our grandfathers never bowed to white authority. They took what they needed and defended what was theirs. Are we less brave than they were?" Bright Star Woman felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders, the burden of being caught between two worlds, two sets of values, two completely different visions of what the future should hold. These young warriors saw only the restrictions imposed by the treaty, not the protection it provided from forces that could destroy their people entirely. "Your grandfathers lived in a world where the Comanche were the most powerful force on the southern plains," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "They faced scattered groups of white settlers and small army units. You would face Colonel Blackwood's entire military district, reinforced by telegraph communications that could bring thousands of additional soldiers within weeks." She paused, studying the faces of the young men before her, seeing in their expressions the same fierce pride that had once driven her to trade herself for her sister's freedom. "But there is another kind of courage," she continued. "The courage to find new ways to remain Comanche while adapting to a changed world. The courage to ensure that our children inherit not just our blood, but our values, our stories, our connection to the spirits of this land." Striking Wolf shook his head in frustration. "Pretty words, but what do they mean? How do we remain Comanche when we cannot hunt where our fathers hunted, cannot raid our enemies, cannot even travel freely across the lands our ancestors gave their lives to defend?" Before Bright Star Woman could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the lodge's entrance, she could see a small party of riders approaching under a white flag, the standard protocol for official communications. Between the Comanche Nation and territorial authorities, the riders proved to be led by Captain Morrison, a young cavalry officer who had served as liaison between Colonel Blackwood's command and the tribal government since the treaty's implementation. Morrison had proven to be respectful and honest in his dealings with the Comanche, qualities that had earned him a grudging acceptance among even the most traditionally minded tribal members. Standing Bear emerged from the council lodge to greet the visitors, and Bright Star Woman could see from his expression that the news they brought was significant. She excused herself from the meeting with Blue Hawk and his companions, promising to continue their discussion later, and made her way carefully down the hill to hear what Captain Morrison had to report. The news was both encouraging and troubling. Colonel Blackwood had been promoted and transferred to a new posting in Arizona Territory, replaced by a commander whose views on Indian policy were significantly more hostile to the accommodation approach that had made the Comanche Treaty possible. Colonel William Sherman, Jr., nephew of the famous Civil War general, had arrived at Fort Riley with explicit orders to normalize the relationship between white authorities and local tribes. "I wanted to give you advance warning," Captain Morrison explained, his discomfort with the message he carried evident in his posture. Colonel Sherman believes the current treaty gives too much autonomy to Indian nations. He's planning to renegotiate several key provisions, particularly those relating to self-governance and territorial boundaries. Standing Bear's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information. What kind of changes does he propose? Morrison glanced around nervously, clearly aware that he was delivering news that could destroy everything they had worked to build. Mandatory enrollment of all Comanche children in federal boarding schools. Consolidation of tribal lands into individual family allotments that can be sold to white settlers. Replacement of tribal law with territorial judicial authority. And double quotes he paused, clearly reluctant to continue. And, Bright Star Woman prompted, and relocation of the entire Comanche nation to a reservation in Indian Territory, alongside other removed tribes. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and ominous. Bright Star Woman could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, not just literally due to her pregnancy, but figuratively as everything they had worked to achieve seemed to crumble like sand castles before an incoming tide. Blue Hawk and his companions had followed her down the hill and heard every word of Morrison's report. She could see in their faces the vindication they felt. Their warnings about white duplicity had proven correct, and the peaceful path she and Standing Bear had chosen had led their people into a trap. "Now do you see?" Blue Hawk said quietly, his voice carrying no triumph despite being proven right. "They never intended to honor the treaty. They used it to buy time while they prepared for our final destruction." Standing Bear's response was measured and thoughtful, the words of a leader who understood that this moment would determine not just their immediate response, but the entire future of their people. "Captain Morrison," he said formally, "you have shown honor in bringing us this news. What is your personal counsel? What options do we have?" The young officer looked genuinely pained by the question. "Honestly, not many. Colonel Sherman has the backing of powerful political forces in Washington who believe that the accommodation policy has failed. They want to see all Western tribes either fully assimilated into white society or physically relocated to areas where they can't interfere with continued expansion." He paused, glancing at Bright Star Woman before continuing. "However, there might be one possibility. The territorial governor is scheduled to visit the region next month. Governor Hamilton is known to be more moderate than Sherman, and he has the authority to overrule military commanders on civilian matters. If you could present your case directly to him." Bright Star Woman felt a familiar stirring of possibility, the same instinct that had guided her through the loyalty test and the original treaty negotiations. There was an opportunity here, but it would require the kind of bold action that carried enormous risks. What would such a presentation require? She asked. Morrison considered carefully before responding. A formal delegation to the territorial capital. High-ranking representatives who could speak authoritatively for the entire Comanche nation. And compelling evidence that your people have fulfilled their treaty obligations while contributing positively to territorial development. The implications were staggering. Such a journey would take them hundreds of miles from their protected territory into the heart of white civilization, where they would be completely dependent on the goodwill of their hosts. Moreover, it would mean leaving their people vulnerable to whatever actions Colonel Sherman might take in their absence. But the alternative, passive acceptance of policies that would destroy everything they had built, was equally unacceptable. Standing Bear and Bright Star Woman exchanged glances that communicated volumes. They had faced impossible choices before and found ways to create new possibilities through courage and ingenuity. This situation, desperate as it appeared, might offer similar opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. We will need time to consider this proposal and consult with our council, Standing Bear told Morrison. How long before Colonel Sherman begins implementing these new policies? 3 months, Morrison replied. Governor Hamilton's visit is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. If you're going to act, it would need to be soon. After Morrison's departure, the tribal council convened in an emergency session. The debate that followed was intense and sometimes bitter, with traditional and progressive factions arguing passionately for completely different responses to the crisis they faced. The traditionalists, led by Blue Hawk and energized by the vindication of their warnings, advocated for immediate rejection of all white authority and a return to the nomadic lifestyle that had served their ancestors for generations. They argued that death in battle was preferable to slow extinction through cultural absorption. The progressives, including many of the elders who had initially supported the treaty, maintained that accommodation remained their best hope for survival. They pointed to the schools, medical facilities, and economic opportunities that peaceful coexistence had brought to their people. But it was Singing Crow who offered the perspective that ultimately shaped their decision. The ancient medicine woman had remained largely silent throughout the crisis, but when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of prophetic vision. I have seen this choice in dreams, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed council lodge. Not the details, but the shape of what must come. We stand at the place where 3 paths meet. One leads to the past where our people become legends and memories. One leads to the future where our people become white men with brown skin. And one leads to a place that has never existed before where our people remain themselves while walking in a new world. She turned to look directly at Bright Star Woman, her ancient eyes holding depths of meaning that seemed to encompass all of time. The woman who was taken as captive and chose to become queen will show us this 3rd path, but only if she has the courage to risk everything once more. As the council session extended deep into the night, Bright Star Woman felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders once again. The child growing within her seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if responding to the momentous decisions being made about the world it would inherit. By dawn, their course was set. A delegation would travel to the territorial capital, led by Standing Bear and Bright Star Woman, despite her advanced pregnancy. They would present their case not as supplicants begging for mercy, but as the representatives of a sovereign nation demanding the respect and recognition that had been promised in their original treaty. It was a desperate gamble that could result in their imprisonment or worse. But it was also their only chance to preserve a future where their unborn child could grow up Comanche in a world that seemed determined to erase everything that word had ever meant. The journey ahead would test every skill they had developed, every alliance they had forged, and every lesson they had learned about the delicate art of surviving between worlds. But as Bright Star Woman prepared for what might be the most important mission of her life, she drew strength from the knowledge that she had already accomplished the impossible once before. She had transformed herself from captive to queen. Now she would discover whether a queen could transform an entire civilization's understanding of what it meant to be human. The territorial capital of Topeka sprawled across the prairie like a declaration of white civilization's intent to dominate the frontier. As the Comanche delegation approached the city's outskirts in the early morning light, Bright Star Woman marveled at how much the settlement had grown since her last glimpse of organized white society. Buildings of brick and stone rose 3 and 4 stories high. Telegraph wires crisscrossed the sky like artificial spider webs, and the constant sound of construction proclaimed a confidence in the future that seemed to mock the uncertainty. Facing her own people, the delegation consisted of 12 carefully chosen representatives, each selected to demonstrate different aspects of Comanche civilization to the white officials they would encounter. Standing Bear rode at their head, magnificent in traditional regalia, but also wearing the silver medallion that marked him as a recognized treaty chief. Bright Star Woman, now 8 months pregnant and riding an especially constructed travois, to protect both her and the unborn child, served as both translator and living symbol of the cultural bridge that made communication possible. Sinine Crow had insisted on making the arduous journey despite her advanced age, claiming that the spirits had told her this mission would determine the fate of 7 generations yet unborn. Grey Wolf accompanied her, his presence lending the gravitas of ancient wisdom to their cause. The remaining members included warriors, craftsmen, and a young woman named Rising Moon, who had mastered both English and arithmetic with startling facility, demonstrating the Comanche capacity for adaptation that lay at the heart of their diplomatic strategy. Their arrival in Topeka created an immediate sensation. Word of their approach had preceded them, and crowds of curious white citizens lined the streets to catch glimpses of the famous Indian Queen, whose story had become legend throughout the territory. Bright Star Woman noticed how the spectators' expressions ranged from fascination to fear to outright hostility, reminding her that public opinion would play a crucial role in determining the success of their mission. Governor Hamilton had agreed to meet with them, but not immediately. Protocol demanded that they first present themselves to Colonel Sherman, whose jurisdiction technically included oversight of all Indian affairs within the territory. This preliminary meeting would take place at the military headquarters, an imposing stone building that dominated the city's central square like a fortress, declaring eternal vigilance against barbarian threats. Colonel Sherman proved to be exactly what Bright Star Woman had expected, a career military officer whose worldview had been shaped by decades of frontier warfare and unwavering belief in the superiority of white civilization. He was a compact man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their appearance for future tactical reference. The meeting took place in Sherman's private office, a room decorated with maps, military commendations, and artifacts taken from defeated Indian warriors. The symbolism was deliberately intimidating, but Bright Star Woman had learned to read such displays as signs of insecurity rather than strength. Men truly confident in their power rarely felt the need to surround themselves with trophies of their victories. "Chief Standing Bear," Sherman began, his tone formal but carrying undertones of condescension, "I understand you wish to discuss modifications to your current treaty arrangements. I should inform you at the outset that the federal government's policy regarding Indian affairs has evolved significantly since that document was negotiated." Standing Bear's response was delivered in flawless English, a linguistic choice that immediately altered the dynamic of the conversation. "Colonel Sherman, we come not to request modifications, but to seek clarification of our mutual obligations under an existing agreement that has served both our peoples well." Sherman's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised by Standing Bear's command of the language and diplomatic protocol. "I see you've been well coached for this meeting. However, the reality is that circumstances have changed. The territory's population has tripled in the past 2 years. Railroad construction has created new transportation needs. Agricultural development requires larger areas of productive land. The accommodation policies of my predecessor simply cannot meet these demands." Bright Star Woman recognized this as her moment to intervene. "Colonel, if I may speak to the specific benefits that peaceful coexistence has provided to territorial development." Sherman's gaze fixed on her with the intensity of a predator studying potential prey. "Mrs. Standing Bear, is it? I'm curious about your perspective on these matters. Your background gives you a unique viewpoint, I'm sure." The careful emphasis on background carried implications that Bright Star Woman chose to address directly. "My background has indeed given me insight into the advantages of cooperation over conflict. In the past 2 years, Comanche traders have contributed over $50,000 in revenue to territorial merchants. Our young people have served as guides and interpreters for survey expeditions, preventing misunderstandings that could have led to violence. And our warriors have helped track down renegade bands that threaten both white and Indian settlements. She paused, allowing these concrete achievements to register before continuing. More importantly, our peaceful relationship has freed military resources for other purposes. How many soldiers have you been able to deploy to other territories because you didn't need them fighting a war against the Comanche Nation? Sherman's expression remained carefully neutral, but Bright Star Woman could see that her points had struck home. Military efficiency was a language he understood, and the strategic value of peaceful borders was undeniable. These are fair points, he conceded. However, they don't address the fundamental issue. The federal government has determined that reservation consolidation is necessary for the long-term welfare of all Indian peoples. Scattered tribal territories create administrative inefficiencies and limit opportunities for education and economic development. Rising Moon chose this moment to speak, her clear young voice cutting through the tension in the room. Colonel Sherman, with respect, our people have already demonstrated significant economic development within our current territory. Would you like to see our agricultural production figures? Our livestock inventories? Our craft production statistics? The young woman's confidence and competence clearly surprised Sherman, who had probably expected to be dealing with stereotypical savage representatives. As Rising Moon presented detailed documentation of Comanche economic achievements, Bright Star Woman could see him reassessing his assumptions about tribal capabilities. But the colonel's next question revealed the true depth of official opposition to their position. Even accepting these accomplishments, which are indeed impressive, the larger policy question remains. How do we justify allowing one Indian nation to maintain semi-autonomous status when all others are being relocated to designated reservations? What precedent does this set for territorial governance? The question struck at the heart of their dilemma. The Comanche Treaty hadn't just created a unique arrangement for their people. It had challenged the entire framework of federal Indian policy. If they succeeded in maintaining their special status, it would encourage other tribes to demand similar treatment, potentially undermining the government's systematic approach to westward expansion. Standing Bear's response addressed this challenge head-on. Colonel, the United States prides itself on being a nation of laws, where agreements once made are honored regardless of changing political convenience. Our treaty was negotiated in good faith by representatives with full authority to bind both parties. To abrogate it now would damage American credibility with other nations, both Indian and foreign. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the cadence of formal oratory. Moreover, our success demonstrates that peaceful coexistence benefits all parties. Why destroy something that works in favor of policies that have repeatedly failed to achieve their stated objectives? The debate continued for over 3 hours, with both sides presenting detailed arguments supported by facts, figures, and legal precedents. Sherman proved to be a more formidable opponent than Bright Star Woman had anticipated. Intelligent, well-informed, and genuinely committed to what he saw as the best interests of territorial development. But she also detected something else in his manner, a grudging respect for their preparation and presentation. Whatever his personal views about Indian policy, Sherman was professional enough to recognize competent adversaries when he encountered them. The meeting concluded without resolution, as both sides had expected. Sherman promised to forward their arguments to higher authorities while making clear his own opposition to continued special treatment for the Comanche Nation. The delegation was granted permission to present their case to Governor Hamilton, but warned that military recommendations would carry significant weight in any final decision. As they left the military headquarters, Bright Star Woman felt a mixture of exhaustion and cautious optimism. They had held their own against a skilled opponent, demonstrating that Comanche leadership could engage with white authorities as equals rather than supplicants. But the real test would come with Governor Hamilton, whose political rather than military perspective might be more receptive to their arguments. The governor's mansion occupied an entire city block, its elaborate Victorian architecture serving as a monument to territorial prosperity and ambition. Gardens filled with exotic plants surrounded the building, while uniformed servants maintained an atmosphere of refined civilization that seemed deliberately designed to emphasize the contrast between white and Indian ways of life. Governor Hamilton himself proved to be a surprise younger than expected, with the kind of Eastern education and cosmopolitan outlook that had become increasingly common among territorial administrators. He received the delegation in an ornate reception room, but his manner was informal and genuinely curious rather than condescending. Chief Standing Bear, Mrs. Standing Bear, honored members of the Comanche delegation, he began. I want you to know that your reputation precedes you. The story of your treaty negotiations has been discussed in political circles from Washington to San Francisco. Many people are watching to see whether accommodation policies can provide a viable alternative to the endless cycle of warfare that has characterized most Indian relations. Bright Star Woman felt a stirring of hope at these words. Hamilton seemed to understand that their situation represented more than just a local territorial issue. It was a test case for an entirely different approach to the challenges of westward expansion. Governor, Standing Bear replied, we appreciate your willingness to hear our perspective. We come not as petitioners seeking charity, but as partners in territorial development who wish to continue contributing to the prosperity of this region. What followed was unlike any political discussion Bright Star Woman had ever witnessed. Hamilton asked probing questions about Comanche governance structures, economic systems, and long-term development plans. He showed genuine interest in their educational initiatives, their legal codes, and their methods for resolving disputes, both within the tribe and with neighboring communities. Most remarkably, he treated Rising Moon's statistical presentations with the same serious attention he would have given to reports from white administrators. When Singing Crow spoke about traditional ecological knowledge and its applications to sustainable resource management, he took careful notes rather than dismissing her words as primitive superstition. I'm particularly interested in your agricultural innovations, Hamilton said at one point. The drought-resistant crops you've developed could have applications throughout the territory. Have you considered formal partnerships with white farming communities? The conversation continued well past the scheduled time, ranging from specific policy details to broad philosophical questions about the nature of civilization and progress. Hamilton's perspective seemed genuinely shaped by exposure to different cultures and ideas, making him receptive to arguments that would have been dismissed by more narrow-minded officials. But even his sympathy had limits, as became clear when they discussed the political realities facing his administration. I want to be completely honest with you, Hamilton said as the formal session drew to a close. There are powerful forces in Washington pushing for reservation consolidation. Railroad interests, mining companies, agricultural syndicates, they all see scattered Indian territories as obstacles to development. They have significant political influence and aren't easily deterred by moral arguments about treaty obligations. He paused, studying their faces before continuing. However, they are susceptible to practical arguments about costs and benefits. If you can demonstrate that your current arrangement produces better results than reservation policies, economically, socially, and politically, then we might be able to build support for maintaining your special status. Bright Star Woman seized on this opening. What kind of demonstration would be most persuasive? Hamilton's smile suggested that he had been hoping for exactly this question. A formal presentation to the Territorial Development Council next month. Representatives from major business interests, military commands, and federal agencies. Show Them concrete evidence that peaceful coexistence serves their interests better than the alternatives. The opportunity was enormous, but so were the risks. Such a presentation would put them at the center of territorial politics, making them either powerful allies or dangerous enemies, depending on the outcome. Moreover, it would require them to remain in Topeka for several more weeks, far from their people during a time of crisis. But as Bright Star Woman felt her unborn child stirring within her, she understood that this might be their last chance to secure a future worth inheriting. The baby would be born into whatever world they managed to create through their choices in the next few weeks. Standing Bear's decision was swift and decisive. "We accept your invitation, Governor. The Comanche Nation will present its case to your council." As the delegation prepared to leave the governor's mansion, Bright Star Woman caught Hamilton's arm for a private word. "Governor, may I ask why you're willing to support us? Many of your colleagues clearly see us as obstacles to progress." Hamilton's expression grew thoughtful. "Mrs. Standing Bear, I've spent considerable time in Europe where I've seen what happens when different peoples are forced to choose between assimilation and extinction. The results are rarely as clean or beneficial as the planners expect. Your people have found a third-way adaptation without surrender. That's not just remarkable, it's potentially revolutionary." He glanced toward the windows overlooking the bustling city. "This territory is going to continue growing and changing. We can either learn to manage that growth in ways that benefit everyone, or we can repeat the same mistakes that have left trails of blood and broken promises across the continent. Your success points toward a better path." As the Comanche delegation settled into temporary quarters provided by sympathetic territorial officials, Bright Star Woman reflected on the complex web of interests and motivations they would need to navigate in the weeks ahead. The presentation to the Development Council would require every skill they had learned about bridging cultures, every alliance they had forged, and every insight they had gained about the delicate balance between adaptation and preservation. But for the first time since Colonel Sherman's arrival had threatened everything they had built, she felt genuinely hopeful about their chances. They had found allies in unexpected places and demonstrated capabilities that even their supporters hadn't fully appreciated. The child within her seemed to sense her mood, moving with what felt like anticipation rather than distress. Perhaps this new life would indeed inherit a world where being Comanche didn't require choosing between survival and dignity. The real test was yet to come. The 3 weeks leading up to the Territorial Development Council presentation proved to be among the most challenging of Bright Star Woman's life. Her pregnancy had reached the stage where every movement required careful consideration, yet the demands of preparing for what might be the most important speech in Comanche history left little time for rest or comfort. The delegation had established their headquarters in a boarding house owned by Margaret Fletcher, a widow whose late husband had been one of the few white traders to deal honestly with Indian peoples. Mrs. Fletcher's support proved invaluable, not just for the practical assistance she provided, but for her insights into the social and political dynamics that would influence their audience. "You need to understand," she explained to Bright Star Woman as they worked together preparing visual aids for the presentation. "Most of these council members have never had a real conversation with an Indian person. Their opinions are based on newspaper stories, military reports, and the kind of tavern talk that gets more dramatic with each retelling." Mrs. Fletcher's drawing room had been transformed into a war room where maps, charts, and statistical tables competed for space with traditional Comanche artifacts that would be used to illustrate key points. Rising Moon had proven particularly gifted at creating visual presentations that translated complex economic data into formats that businessmen could quickly grasp and appreciate. But the most valuable intelligence came from an unexpected source: Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, a physician and naturalist who had spent considerable time studying tribal medical practices. Whitmore had become fascinated by Singing Crow's knowledge of medicinal plants and had volunteered to serve as an informal advisor to the delegation. "The railroad representatives will be your biggest challenge," he warned during one of their strategy sessions. "They see every acre of tribal land as a potential right-of-way or depot site. But they're also pragmatic businessmen who understand the value of peaceful relations for protecting their investments." Whitmore's connections in the territorial scientific community had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Several prominent academics had agreed to attend the presentation, lending intellectual credibility to arguments that might otherwise be dismissed as sentimentality or special pleading. Meanwhile, word of the upcoming presentation had spread throughout Topeka's social circles, creating a buzz of anticipation that both helped and hindered their cause. Sympathetic citizens organized informal gatherings where delegation members could meet potential allies, but hostile factions also mobilized to ensure that opposing voices would be heard. The most disturbing development came when Captain Morrison arrived with urgent news from the Comanche territory. Colonel Sherman had used the delegation's absence to begin implementing his new policies unilaterally, establishing military checkpoints at key travel routes and demanding that all tribal members carry identification papers when moving beyond their immediate settlements. "There's been no violence yet," Morrison reported privately to Standing Bear and Bright Star Woman, "but tensions are escalating rapidly. Some of the younger warriors are talking about armed resistance, and Sherman seems to be looking for an excuse to declare the treaty void due to non-compliance." The news created an additional layer of urgency around their mission. Not only did they need to persuade the Development Council to support their position, but they had to do so quickly enough to prevent the situation back home from exploding into the kind of violence that would justify exactly the policies they were trying to prevent. Bright Star Woman found herself caught between the immediate demands of preparation and the growing certainty that her child would be born before they could return home. Local physicians had examined her and confirmed what she already knew: the baby would arrive within days, not weeks. "Perhaps you should remain here for the birth," Standing Bear suggested during one of their private conversations. "The presentation is important, but your safety and the child's health must come first." But Bright Star Woman had lived through too much to be deterred by physical discomfort now. "This presentation may determine what kind of world our child inherits," she replied firmly. "I need to be there, not just as your wife, but as living proof that cultural bridges can be built and maintained." The night before the presentation, the delegation gathered for a traditional ceremony conducted by Singing Crow in the privacy of their quarters. The ancient medicine woman had brought sacred objects from their homeland, and her prayers connected them spiritually to the ancestors whose guidance they would need for the challenges ahead. "Tomorrow you speak not just for the living, but for all those who came before and all those yet to be born," Singing Crow intoned as she blessed each member of the delegation. "Carry their voices with you and remember that truth spoken with courage has power beyond the understanding of those who hear only words." The ceremony concluded with the singing of traditional songs that seemed to transform Mrs. Fletcher's modest drawing room into a sacred space where two worlds could meet and find common ground. Even Dr. Whitmore, initially skeptical about Indian spiritual practices, found himself moved by the dignity and power of the ancient rituals. The morning of the presentation dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of heavy clouds that promised storms before evening. Bright Star Woman woke before sunrise, her body reminding her with increasing insistence that her time was approaching. But she had endured too much to surrender now to the demands of biology. The council chamber occupied the entire second floor of Topeka's new civic building, its walls lined with portraits of territorial pioneers and maps, showing the steady progress of white settlement across the region. Representatives began arriving early, their conversations creating a buzz of anticipation that filled the ornate room with nervous energy. Bright Star. Women studied the faces of their audience as delegation members took their places at the front of the chamber. Railroad executives in expensive suits clustered around charts showing proposed construction routes. Military officers maintained rigid postures that suggested skepticism about civilian interference in their sphere of authority. Territorial officials shuffled papers and exchanged glances that revealed their own uncertainty about the wisdom of this unprecedented gathering. But there were also encouraging signs. Dr. Whitmore had succeeded in bringing several respected academics, whose presence lent intellectual credibility to the proceedings. A handful of progressive business leaders, including 2 prominent merchants who had profited from trade with the Comanche, sat in positions where their support would be visible to other attendees. And Governor Hamilton himself occupied the chairman's seat with an expression of genuine interest rather than mere political obligation. Standing Bear opened the presentation with a formal address that immediately established the delegation's credibility and seriousness of purpose. Speaking in careful, precise English, he outlined the Comanche Nation's achievements under the current treaty, while acknowledging the legitimate concerns that had prompted calls for policy changes. "Honorable members of the council," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "we come before you not as supplicants seeking charity, but as partners in territorial development who have proven our value through deeds rather than words." Rising Moon followed with her statistical presentation, using carefully prepared charts to demonstrate the economic benefits that peaceful coexistence had brought to the territory. Her command of complex financial data clearly impressed the business representatives, several of whom leaned forward to study her projections with obvious interest. But it was Bright Star Woman's address that transformed the tenor of the entire gathering. Rising carefully to her feet despite her advanced pregnancy, she spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through every aspect of the cultural bridge they were asking the territory to preserve. "Gentlemen, 3 years ago, I was Sarah McKenna, a frontier farmer's daughter who knew Indians only as enemies to be feared and avoided. Today I am Bright Star Woman, wife of a Comanche chief and mother-to-be of the next generation that will inherit whatever world we create together." She paused, letting this personal testimony establish her unique qualifications to speak on the subject. "I have seen both sides of the cultural divide that separates our peoples. I have witnessed the fear and misunderstanding that leads to violence and tragedy. But I have also experienced the possibilities that emerge when fear gives way to mutual respect and cooperation." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, drawing strength from the weight of her personal journey and the child stirring within her. "The current treaty has not just prevented war, it has created something unprecedented in the history of this continent. A relationship between peoples based on negotiation rather than conquest, adaptation rather than destruction, mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition." She gestured toward Rising Moon's charts and the display of Comanche crafts that decorated the chamber. "You have seen the statistics that prove our economic contribution to territorial development. But statistics cannot capture the full value of what we have achieved together. We have demonstrated that cultural diversity can be a source of strength rather than weakness, that different ways of understanding the world can complement rather than compete with each other." A murmur of interest rippled through the audience as she spoke, and Bright Star Woman could sense a shift in the chamber's atmosphere. These hard-headed businessmen and pragmatic officials were beginning to see beyond stereotypes and political rhetoric to the practical advantages of the arrangement they were being asked to preserve. "The choice before you today is not simply whether to maintain one Indian treaty among many," she continued, her voice taking on the cadence of prophecy. "You are deciding whether this territory will lead the nation toward a new model of development, one that builds on the strengths of all its peoples rather than requiring the destruction of some for the advancement of others." Her next words carried personal conviction that resonated through every corner of the chamber. My child will be born within days, perhaps hours. That child will be both Comanche and American, heir to traditions that stretch back thousands of years and to possibilities that have never existed before. The world we create for that child will reflect the wisdom or folly of the choices we make in this room today. As she spoke these words, Bright Star Woman felt a familiar tightening in her abdomen, stronger than the discomfort she had been experiencing, unmistakably the beginning of labor. But she forced herself to continue, knowing that this might be her only opportunity to speak for the future her child would inherit. We ask you to choose courage over fear, innovation over tradition, partnership over domination. We ask you to help us prove that the American promise of opportunity and justice can extend to all peoples who are willing to earn their place through honest contribution to the common good. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, coming not just from their known supporters, but from throughout the chamber. Even some of the railroad executives and military officers joined in, caught up in the power of her personal testimony and the logic of her arguments. But as the ovation continued, Bright Star Woman felt another contraction, stronger than the first, and knew that her body was no longer willing to wait for political convenience. The child that had been stirring throughout the presentation was demanding to be born into the world they were fighting to create. Standing, Bear saw her distress immediately and moved to support her, but she remained standing long enough to deliver her final words. "The future is being born even as we speak," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the physical strain she was experiencing. "The question is whether that future will emerge into a world of hope or fear, cooperation or conflict, possibility or limitation." As the delegation members rushed to assist her, and Dr. Whitmore pushed through the crowd to provide medical attention, Bright Star Woman felt a profound sense of completion. She had spoken not just for her people, but for the unborn generations whose world would be shaped by the decisions made in rooms like this one. The presentation had been more than a political success. It had been a transformative moment that changed how everyone present understood the possibilities and responsibilities of territorial development. Whether that understanding would translate into concrete policy changes remained to be seen. But the seed had been planted in fertile ground. As willing hands helped her from the chamber toward the medical care she urgently needed, Bright Star Woman caught Governor Hamilton's eye and saw in his expression a recognition of what had just occurred. This had not been merely a political presentation, but a moment of historical significance that would influence territorial policy for generations to come. The contractions were coming faster now, demanding her full attention. But even as her body prepared to bring new life into the world, Bright Star Woman felt confident that the life emerging would inherit a future worth living, future where being both Comanche and American would be a source of strength rather than a burden to be endured. The real test of their success would come in the days and weeks ahead, as the Development Council deliberated and politicians calculated the costs and benefits of supporting their position. But for now, it was enough to know that they had spoken their truth with courage and conviction, planting seeds of understanding that would grow in ways they could not yet imagine. The next chapter of their story was about to begin, written not in words but in the cry of a newborn child, entering a world transformed by its parents' courage to dream of possibilities beyond the limitations of their time. The cry that pierced the dawn air of Topeka was not just the sound of a newborn child entering the world, it was the voice of a new generation, announcing its arrival into a landscape forever changed by its parents' courage. As Dr. Whitmore placed the squalling infant in Bright Star Woman's arms, she marveled at how perfectly the timing had worked out. Her daughter had chosen to be born on the very day the Territorial Development Council would vote on the future of the Comanche Nation. She has her mother's sense of dramatic timing. Standing there observed with exhausted pride as he gazed down at his daughter. The baby's eyes dark and alert despite her recent arrival, seemed to take in everything around her with the kind of intense curiosity that suggested she understood the significance of the moment. Word of the birth had spread quickly through Topeka's social circles, adding an unexpectedly personal dimension to the political drama unfolding in the territorial capital. Even hardened railroad executives found themselves moved by the image of a newborn child, whose future would be directly affected by their deliberations. Governor Hamilton arrived at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house within hours of receiving the news, bringing with him both congratulations and the preliminary results of the council's discussions. His expression carried a mixture of excitement and amazement that suggested events had unfolded in ways no one had anticipated. "The presentation has created quite a stir," he reported to Standing Bear and Bright Star Woman as she nursed her daughter. Several council members have described it as the most compelling political speech they've ever heard. The combination of practical economic arguments and personal testimony has forced people to reconsider assumptions they've held for years. But the governor's most surprising news concerned reactions from constituencies that had been expected to oppose their position most strongly. 3 of the major railroad representatives have expressed interest in formal partnerships with the Comanche Nation. Hamilton continued, "They're impressed by your people's knowledge of local geography and weather patterns, and they see potential value in having reliable allies rather than constant enemies along their planned routes." Even more encouraging was the response from military leadership. Colonel Sherman had been overruled by his own superiors after reports of the presentation reached Army headquarters in Kansas City. The heavy-handed tactics he had implemented during the delegation's absence were being reversed, and he was being transferred to a position where his aggressive approach would be less likely to undermine broader strategic objectives. Standing Bear received this news with careful restraint, understanding that political victories could be reversed as quickly as they were won. "What specific commitments has the council made?" Hamilton's smile widened. "They voted to recommend maintaining the current treaty arrangements while expanding the pilot program to include other tribes willing to meet similar standards of cooperation and development. Your success has become a model for territorial policy rather than an exception to it." The implications were staggering. The Comanche experiment in cultural adaptation had proven so successful that it was being adopted as official policy for managing relationships with other Indian nations. Instead of being forced to choose between extinction and assimilation, tribes throughout the territory would have the opportunity to maintain their cultural identity while participating in the broader economic and social development of the region. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Emma McKenna arrived at the boarding house 3 days after her niece's birth, having traveled from Cedar Falls as soon as she received word of the baby's arrival. The reunion between the sisters was emotional and complex, marked by years of separation and radically different life experiences. Emma had prospered in white society, finding work as a teacher and eventually marrying a prosperous merchant who treated her with kindness and respect. But seeing her sister holding a Comanche baby in a room decorated with Indian artifacts clearly challenged everything she thought she knew about civilization and progress. "I don't understand how you can be happy living this way," Emma admitted, as she held her niece for the first time. "You gave up everything familiar, everything safe, everything we were raised to believe was important." Bright Star Woman studied her sister's face, seeing in it reflections of her own former self, the frightened frontier girl, who had once believed that safety could only be found within the narrow confines of white society. "I didn't give up anything important," she replied gently. "I found things I never knew I was missing. Purpose, partnership, the chance to be part of something larger than myself. Look around you, Emma. Do I seem like someone who has sacrificed her happiness for duty?" As if responding to her mother's words, the baby opened her eyes and gazed solemnly at her aunt, tiny fingers grasping at the air with determined purpose. Emma's expression softened as she studied the child's features, seeing in them a blending of cultures that somehow seemed natural rather than strange. "What will you name her?" Emma asked softly. Standing Bear and Bright Star Woman had discussed this question extensively, understanding that their daughter's name would carry symbolic weight far beyond its personal significance. "Dawn Walker," Bright Star Woman announced. "She who walks between the darkness and the light, bringing a new day to both worlds." The name felt perfect in ways that went beyond mere symbolism. Dawn Walker would grow up in a world where being both Comanche and American would be a source of strength rather than confusion, where cultural bridges were valued rather than feared, where the possibility of peaceful coexistence had been proven rather than merely hoped for. Over the following weeks, as Bright Star Woman recovered from childbirth and the delegation prepared for their return to Comanche territory, the full implications of their success began to become clear. The territorial capital buzzed with discussions about the Comanche model and its potential applications to other challenging relationships between different cultural groups. Dr. Whitmore had begun documenting traditional Comanche medical practices, with Singing Crow's enthusiastic cooperation, creating the foundation for what would become groundbreaking research into the integration of indigenous and European healing methods. Academic institutions from as far away as Harvard and Yale were sending representatives to study the political and social innovations that had emerged from the unlikely partnership between a frontier girl and a Comanche warrior. But the most meaningful changes were occurring at the personal level, in individual hearts and minds, where fear was being replaced by curiosity, prejudice by understanding, and hatred by the possibility of mutual respect. Captain Morrison, who had served as liaison between the military and tribal authorities, requested assignment to the newly created Department of Indian Cooperation, where his experience with successful cross-cultural communication would be invaluable in extending the Comanche model to other tribal relationships. Mrs. Fletcher announced her intention to establish a formal school for cultural interpreters, training young people from both white and Indian backgrounds to serve as bridges between communities that had previously viewed each other only as enemies or obstacles. Even Colonel Sherman, before his transfer, had grudgingly admitted that the accommodation approach had achieved better results than traditional military methods. His final report to Army headquarters acknowledged that peaceful coexistence had proven more effective than warfare in securing territorial stability and promoting economic development. As the delegation prepared to depart Topeka, Governor Hamilton organized a farewell ceremony that demonstrated how completely attitudes had shifted during their stay. The same civic building that had witnessed their dramatic presentation now hosted a celebration attended by hundreds of territorial citizens who came to honor their contributions and wish them well. The speeches delivered that evening reflected a fundamental transformation in how white society understood the possibilities of cultural cooperation. Business leaders spoke enthusiastically about expanded trade relationships. Religious leaders praised the spiritual insights that cross-cultural dialogue had provided. Even former skeptics acknowledged that the Comanche delegation had opened their eyes to perspectives they had never considered. But it was Dawn Walker herself who provided the most powerful symbol of what they had accomplished. As her mother held her during the ceremony, the baby gazed out at the mixed crowd of white and Indian faces with the kind of calm acceptance that suggested she saw nothing unusual about the gathering. For her, this blending of cultures would be normal rather than remarkable, possible rather than impossible. The journey home took on the character of a triumphal procession as word of their success spread ahead of them. At every settlement and trading post along their route, crowds gathered to catch glimpses of the Indian Queen and her newborn daughter, who had somehow managed to change the course of territorial history through the power of their personal story. But the most meaningful welcome awaited them in the hidden valley, where their own people had spent months wondering whether their leaders would return as heroes or prisoners. The celebration that erupted upon their arrival lasted for 3 days, with traditional dances and songs mixing with new compositions, created specifically to commemorate their unprecedented diplomatic victory. Blue Hawk, who had been among the most vocal opponents of the accommodation approach, publicly acknowledged his error and pledged his support for the policies that had proven so successful. The unity that had been fractured by doubts and disagreements was restored stronger than before, tempered by the knowledge that their survival depended on maintaining the delicate balance between adaptation and preservation. As Bright Star Woman stood on the familiar hill overlooking her adopted home, holding Dawn Walker in her arms, while Standing Bear's hand rested on her shoulder, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened captive, who had once hidden behind an overturned wagon, had become a queen whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of any single tribe or territory. But more importantly, she had become the mother of a child who would inherit a world where such transformations were possible, where courage and love could triumph over fear and hatred, where the future held possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. Dawn Walker stirred in her arms, tiny eyes opening to gaze up at the vast sky where eagles soared on thermals rising from the warming earth. In those dark eyes, Bright Star Woman saw reflections of all the generations yet to come, children who would grow up taking for granted the peace their parents had fought to achieve, who would build on the foundations laid by those who had dared to dream of a better world. The hidden valley spread below them, no longer a refuge from a hostile world, but the capital of a nation that had found its place in a larger community of peoples. And in that moment, as the sun set behind the western mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Bright Star Woman knew that their story would continue in ways they could not yet imagine, written by children who would inherit both the wisdom of their ancestors and the courage to create new possibilities from the materials of their time. The girl who had traded herself for her sister's freedom had become a woman who had traded fear for hope, isolation for community, and limitations for infinite possibility. And in doing so, she had changed not just her own destiny, but the destiny of 2 peoples and all the generations yet to be born. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.